Howdy folks, welcome back to World of Warships, and today's video is going to be slightly different. This is not going to be a random battle replay with some commentary over it. This is going to be me doing commentary, but instead I'm going to be commenting on the two hot potatoes that have just been announced as far as World of Warships is concerned. The aircraft carrier rebalanced prototype gameplay concept, and those of you who have been keeping up to date with the very latest news, submarines are coming to World of Warships. I'm going to start off by talking about submarine gameplay. We'll be talking about aircraft carriers later on, and I'll also be explaining why it's taken me 2 weeks to talk about aircraft carriers. Trust me, there is actually a very good reason. But for now, submarines. So, they've said for a long time that there are never going to be submarines in World of Warships, and now suddenly, oh look, submarines in World of Warships. Well, technically yes, but also technically no. What is not happening is they are not introducing submarines as a fifth playable type of vessel alongside destroyers, cruisers, battleships and aircraft carriers. Anyone who tells you that this is going to happen is talking out of their arse, because nobody knows this for a fact. What they are doing is taking advantage of the upcoming Halloween special event in order to test, using us as guinea pigs, what will hopefully be an enjoyable experience, testing out the idea of submarine gameplay in World of Warships. And what may happen, based on data that Wargaming collect during the Halloween event, and feedback from us the players, is that further resources may then be set aside to refine the concept and develop it further into actual, proper, general population gameplay. But even if that is the case and everything goes very well, do not expect to see submarines available as a fifth type of vessel in World of Warships this year. Right, disclaimer aside, what is it that we're actually looking at here? Well, what we're not looking at, and what we're not going to be looking at all in the foreseeable future, is anti-submarine warfare. That's going to require a whole period of testing all on its own. For the moment, all Wargaming are really interested in is finding out whether or not submarines can actually work as a playable class. So this is what we know so far about the basic concept that Wargaming have for submarines. First, let's talk about that oxygen meter. This is it here. You can see that this submarine at periscope depth has been detected and is coming under attack, which has forced the captain to dive, but he doesn't have a lot of oxygen, so he's not going to be able to stay submerged for long. What isn't yet clear at this point is what exactly happens to a submarine in World of Warships if it's submerged when its oxygen reserves expire. Is it going to be forced to the surface, or is it going to simply take damage the longer it stays underwater without any oxygen? Questions like that, I suppose, are exactly why they're testing the concept in the upcoming Halloween special event. As you can see, submarine caught on the surface doesn't have a whole lot of options other than to emergency dive. And when I say dive, I don't mean just going to periscope depth, as this submarine is, because it can still be seen. You do apparently have to get much closer to actually spot a submarine when it's at periscope depth, or to spot it visually. More on that later. But periscope depth doesn't mean you're invisible. A submarine is most visible when it's fully on the surface. It's less visible when it's at periscope depth, and it's completely invisible when it's fully submerged. Although a submarine at any depth will always be detected with hydroacoustic search. And potentially, a submarine at periscope depth may be detected by radar. But now we're starting to stray into the realm of anti-submarine warfare rather than submarine warfare, and that's well outside the scope of the upcoming Halloween special event. So, back on topic for the moment. So, submarine warfare. How's it going to work? How is the captain of a submarine going to sink you and your destroyer, cruiser, battleship or aircraft carrier? Well, with his torpedoes, obviously. But that's a little bit harder to do in a submarine than in a, for example, destroyer. Destroyers often have torpedo launchers that can rotate a full 360 degrees. Submarines don't have that. They've got torpedo tubes in the bow, and they've got torpedo tubes in the stern, which means that submarines can only fire their torpedoes straight ahead or straight to the rear, which means positioning is going to be the key for a successful submarine captain. Figuring out where you're going to make that attack, getting to that position undetected, carrying out the attack, and then hopefully escaping without being detected. And how accurate your torpedoes are going to be is going to be a function of how deep the submarine is when you launch the attack. If you're surfaced, where your submarine is at its fastest and better able to actually get into attack position, you're also at your most visible and therefore your most vulnerable. And while you're on the surface, you also have much better visibility of your potential targets, but your torpedo spread is pretty wide. I mean, it's fairly tight by surface ship standards, but it's much better if you're actually at periscope depth. Plus, you also have the added benefit of now being much harder to detect in return, but the act of submerging drastically slows the submarine down. And it also starts to eat away at that oxygen meter. And once you've made your attack, you're likely to stir up a hornet's nest of anti-submarine activity, and you can't stay under forever. The depth that you can dive to is not unlimited either. Although at this point I can't say for sure exactly what's going to happen to a submarine if it exceeds its crush depth. You'd expect it to be crushed. I mean, that's why they call it a crush depth. Or more accurately, it was called a test depth. It was the depth that the submarine had successfully been tested at. You could exceed the test depth, but you kind of voided your warranty if you did it a little too often. We shall see. These are all the kind of questions that are going to be answered during the testing process. The questions that are not going to be answered during the initial testing process in the upcoming Halloween special event, however, are questions about anti-submarine warfare. How are destroyers, aircraft carriers, cruisers and battleships going to sink submarines? You can't shoot them unless they're on the surface. What happens when they dive? Well, we already know that they're going to be detectable by hydroacoustic search, which is already a consumable in the game. We don't know whether or not submarines at periscope depths can have their periscopes detected by radar. It's a good question. They should, but we just don't know. And there are also a lot of questions that still remain to be answered, and probably will be answered, although not in the first round of testing, as to how you're actually going to deal with a submarine once it has submerged. Historically, there were two main methods of disposing of submerged submarines. Depth charges, which were basically just cans of high explosive dumped over the side and set to detonate at a certain depth, and the Hedgehog launcher, which was a little bit more sophisticated and basically involved firing a whole bunch of mortars with shape-to-charge bombs on them, which would be scattered all over an area where you suspected there was a submarine, sink and then explode when they hit something, and were very effective. Well, we don't know if there are going to be hedgehogs, but we do know that there are going to be depth charges. And Wargaming have said, at the moment, that depth charges are only going to be carried by destroyers. I suspect that may change, but for now, destroyers only. And in the Halloween special event, the depth charges dropped by the AI are set to detonate at random depths. Again, this is something that I would expect to change at some point in the distant future, assuming this Halloween special event goes well and they do decide to throw more resources at this, and they start to think about anti-submarine warfare, for a couple of reasons. Because, first and foremost, it adds a little bit more skill to the role of anti-submarine warfare captain, rather than just arriving in the approximate location of an enemy submarine and just dumping your depth charges over the side and crossing your fingers. This will inevitably add a little more complexity to the game, and that may not necessarily be a good thing, but the tactical options, for example, we talked about crush depth earlier, and it was a fact that close depth charges detonated above a submerged submarine would drive it deeper in depth. And if you could choose to drive a submarine that you already know is at or near its crush depth deeper even further by detonating your depth charges above him, you could force them below their crush depth and kill them. Alternatively, if you knew the submarine was actually at quite a shallow depth, you could set your depth charges to detonate underneath him, thereby forcing him to the surface where you could finish him off with your guns. And then of course we've got the question of enhanced submarine technologies, and I'll just give you one example, the snorkel. This was a device that allowed a submarine at periscope depth to breathe. Submarines on the surface ran on their diesel engines. Diesel engines are internal combustion engines, and it's the combustion part that's important, because for combustion you need oxygen. Oxygen is something that's in very, very short supply when the submarine is not on the surface. The introduction of snorkels allowed the submarines to draw in air from the surface when they were at periscope depth. and this therefore allowed them to run their diesel engines when they were partially submerged, and also fresh air for the crew. The downside is that it was damn noisy, and also quite conspicuous on the surface. So perhaps, and I don't know whether or not, I must remind you, this is all complete speculation on my behalf, but this might be something that they could introduce, whether as a consumable, or an upgrade, or simply a piece of equipment that's only available to higher tech tree submarines, that would, for example, allow you to not consume oxygen while you were at periscope depth, and also allow you to run at higher speeds because you were using the diesel engine. All of this, of course, and any questions I may have raised about anti-submarine warfare are, at this stage, complete speculation on my behalf. But I raise these questions and options just to give you an idea of the kind of challenges that are going to be ahead of wargaming if they're serious about introducing submarines into the game as a fifth playable vessel type. The first step, of course, is gathering data from the Halloween special event, and for that they're going to require people to actually play the things, which I'm sure isn't going to be too much of a problem because people are going to be naturally curious about what it's like to actually have the experience of commanding a submarine in World of Warships. But your feedback during the event is going to be very important, and they are going to be paying very, very close attention to it. So, submarines. That moves us on to our second topic of discussion for today's video, the aircraft carrier rebalance. Now, I realise that 2 weeks ago I did say I was going to be talking about this, and yet I have remained suspiciously silent on the subject ever since. The reason for that is that I was expecting by now to have actually been able to play it, and therefore to be able to speak from a slightly better position of authority. Unfortunately, for various different reasons, that hasn't been the case, although I am still expecting, relatively soon, to be able to get my hands on a playable build. And hopefully it won't be under NDA, and I will actually be able to show you some gameplay footage beyond what you've already seen from Wargaming on YouTube. At this point, you guys actually know as much about the carrier rebalance as I do. What you've seen, and what is actually running now in the background, is the footage that was provided by Wargaming during their carrier gameplay reveal, and is essentially just a much more polished version of the very, very rough and basic gameplay that we community contributors got to playtest when we were at the Community Contributors Summit in St. Petersburg. So, bearing that in mind, why do they even need to change aircraft carrier gameplay in the first place? Well, there are a couple of reasons, but first and foremost, it's just too hard. A good aircraft carrier player is very rare, and they are very rare because it is so hard to be a good aircraft carrier player, given the way that carriers are currently managed. Moreover, somebody who is a good aircraft carrier player is just far too powerful. If they decide that they want to sink you, they are going to sink you, and there is nothing you can do about it. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a destroyer, a battleship, another aircraft carrier, or even a full anti-air spec cruiser. You're going to get sunk. It's just a question of how many aircraft the carrier player is prepared to lose in order to do it. And it shouldn't be like that. You, the target, or more accurately the victim, should be able to do something about it, and at the moment all you can do about it is hit the defensive fire button and cross your fingers. And don't forget, sinking your fully AA-spec'd Des Moines is not the only thing that the aircraft carrier is simultaneously doing. They're also dive-bombing your gearing as it's attempting to cap, and using its fighters to not just spot your entire fleet, but also the torpedoes that your Shimakaze is attempting to sink the enemy Bismarck with. Now, none of this was easy. In fact, it was very, very difficult. That's part of the problem. But if you were good enough, and not many people were, you could do all of this at the same time in an aircraft carrier. And that was just way too much power to be in the hands of one player on a team. And God help you if the enemy team had an aircraft carrier player who could do that, and you had one of the multitude of aircraft carrier players who were mere mortals and couldn't, because you were probably going to lose. And again, too much power in the hands of one player. So the whole process of controlling an aircraft carrier needed to be simplified. And how are you going to do that with the current aircraft carrier gameplay model without just nerfing aircraft carriers? Yeah, good question. Also, another good question. How are you going to control an aircraft carrier with a gamepad? Pretty stupid question, Jingles. I don't need a gamepad. I'm a member of the PC Master Race. I've got a mouse and keyboard, thanks very much. Well, yeah, but World of Warships Legends has just been, well, it's not just been announced, but it's very soon going into alpha testing. It's the console version of World of Warships. I'll ask the question again, how are you going to control an aircraft carrier with a gamepad? Short answer, you just can't. Not unless you vastly simplify the process of playing an aircraft carrier. The problem is that vastly simplifying usually means nerfing or dumbing down. But with the current aircraft carrier gameplay model, how else are you going to do it? Because they need more people to be playing aircraft carriers to a reasonably high standard. They're not expecting every aircraft carrier player to be an expert, but there need to be more than 30 of them, which is kind of where we are right now. You've basically got a couple of dozen very, very good aircraft carrier players, and everybody else kind of sucks. And that's just not sustainable, not if you want to keep aircraft carriers in the game. So something had to change. Also, another factor, maybe not as important as the others, but controlling a destroyer isn't 1,000 miles away from the experience of controlling a cruiser or a battleship. But you jump into an aircraft carrier and you may as well be playing a different game. And that's probably one of the reasons why so few people play aircraft carriers in World of Warships more than once, because they just don't know what they're doing. Which is entirely understandable, because it is like you're playing an entirely different game. And so those were the things that they felt they needed to change, and yet it was important that they changed them without just dumbing everything down and nerfing it into oblivion. And that's why they decided that the whole core gameplay experience of playing a carrier just had to be redone from the ground up. All of which brings us to this. Now, it's very important that you actually understand what it is that you're looking at here. This is not the finished product. This is just a proof of concept. Everything that you see here can and will be tweaked, and yet at the same time we can still see a couple of core gameplay mechanics. The attack run, for example, with the torpedo bombers. The longer they stay on target, the narrower the spread of the torpedoes, but the longer they remain exposed to anti-aircraft fire. You'll notice that the entire squadron didn't conduct the attack, just one element of the squadron did, a 3-ship element. That element have now dropped their weapons, but the remaining aircraft in the squadron can conduct further attacks, with another 3-ship element. Once again, the longer they stay on the attack run, the more accurate and narrow the spread of the torpedoes, but the longer they're staying within the kill zone of anti-aircraft fire. Now, a lot of the reactions upon seeing this much of the gameplay reveal seem to revolve around two things. One, wow, that anti-aircraft fire sucked, it didn't seem to do anything. This is a carrier gameplay reveal trailer. It's not an anti-aircraft gameplay reveal trailer, okay? And secondly, wow, that was just way too easy. Those ships weren't even maneuvering. This is also not a ship maneuvering reveal trailer. We are all fully aware of how ships can maneuver. What we have not yet seen, and what this trailer was designed to show off, was how torpedo bombers are likely to end up conducting attacks. A slightly more valid concern, in my opinion, was why are the rest of the squadron, these ones, the ones not conducting the attack, why are they flying directly over the target and getting hammered by its anti-aircraft fire? Because once the carrier player commits to the attack, they only directly control that 3-ship element conducting the attack. All of these guys just seem to fly above them, getting hammered by anti-aircraft fire. And that's a good question, and I'm sure that if that proves to be an issue, because once again, all that we're seeing here is a demonstration of the core gameplay mechanics, and I'm sure that if that proves to be an issue, it'll get changed. What we really need to be focusing on here are not those kind of details at this early stage, because all of this still needs to be tweaked and balanced. It's a proof of concept only. The question we should be asking is that if this was the gameplay experience for a carrier captain in the future, would we start playing aircraft carriers? Or would we go back to playing aircraft carriers? You see, all you're actually controlling here is one squadron at a time, and you're controlling that squadron in more or less the same way that somebody else would control a destroyer, a cruiser, or a battleship. the carrier player makes the decision of which squadron to launch. In this case, we've gone with dive bombers. It could have been torpedo bombers, it could have been attack planes. But not fighters. Apparently fighters are being removed. Well, not exactly. The current idea is that they're going to exist, but as a consumable. What does that mean? Well, I'm not entirely sure, because I haven't had a chance to play it yet. But we can speculate. Let's say, for example, we're conducting attacks with this squadron of dive bombers. And then something unforeseen happens. I don't know, say for example your carrier starts getting shot at by an enemy destroyer or cruiser, and you badly need aircraft to defend you somewhere else on the map, too far away for the dive bombers to effectively intervene. At the same time, however, the dive bombers, which are currently working over these enemy ships, are also spotting these enemy ships, and your team would probably appreciate it if you could continue to spot these enemy ships, but you can't do that with the dive bombers and defend yourself at the same time. So, what you do is you use the dive bombers to trigger your fighter consumable, which summons a squadron of fighters to continue spotting the targets, and then you launch your attack planes from the carrier. Launching another squadron from the carrier relinquishes control of this squadron of dive bombers, who will then automatically fly back to the carrier and land on the flight deck, while you are controlling the attack planes in an effort to try to defend yourself from surface attack. This is just one example of how the fighter consumable might be used. I'm sure you can think of others. You might fly your dive bombers over friendly ships en route to a target and trigger the fighter consumable to protect the friendly ships from incoming enemy strike planes. You might be conducting a dive bomber attack on an enemy destroyer, or a torpedo bomber attack on an enemy destroyer who's contesting a cap circle. But the destroyer proves to be very, very good at dodging torpedoes, so rather than continuing to try to waste torpedoes on a destroyer, you just summon fighters to the cap to keep the destroyer spotted for the rest of the team, while you take the torpedo bombers away to look for targets that are easier to hit with torpedoes. These are just ideas. I'm sure you can think of many more. I'm sure you get the general idea. You only control one squadron at a time, but there are multiple elements within that squadron, which means you can conduct multiple attacks with that squadron. People have asked whether or not you could conduct an alpha strike with that squadron. Instead of just sending one element of 3 aircraft in to conduct the attack, can you not just have the entire squadron dive in? Good question. I believe Wargaming have answered no to that question, because once again then we have the issue of an aircraft carrier just being too powerful. But again, this is something that may change based on the results of testing and feedback. Finally, we come to the attack planes. Now, this is a new addition, and these guys are basically firing rockets, which don't do a huge amount of damage, but do seem to set a lot of fires. I can probably tell you, without risking breaking a non-disclosure agreement, that back when, I mean, you know, the cat's well and truly out of the bag at this point, so I don't suppose it really matters. There were no attack planes in the gameplay model that I got my hands on in St. Petersburg. Instead, we still had fighters, but fighters were able to conduct strafing attacks, just using their machine guns and cannon, to do small amounts of damage to surface vessels. The idea being that if you were desperate and you had nothing else available, and there was an enemy ship that just needed finishing off, you could do it, maybe, with your fighters. Instead, they've gone with the introduction of attack planes, and they've decided that, well, for now at least, fighters are just going to be a consumable that can be called in, probably with a limited number of uses. So that is pretty much it, for the moment at least. No doubt whatsoever that many things are going to change. As the super testers, and eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later, we community contributors get our hands on it and start providing feedback, and then of course at some point it's going to go into general testing, and you are also going to be able to get your hands on it. But you lot are almost certainly not going to be able to get your hands on it until everything has been tweaked and balanced, and by that I don't just mean the carrier gameplay, I also mean the surface ship gameplay, because a change of this size is probably also going to require a complete overhaul of the captain's skill tree for just one thing, because all of the aircraft or anti-aircraft skills are also going to have to change. And you're seeing none of that at this early stage in this gameplay reveal trailer. Now, I don't know about you lot, but I definitely fall into the category of players that tried aircraft carriers once, decided it was far too hard and I was never going to be any good at it, and never went back. At the moment I own exactly 2 aircraft carriers. I've got the Hosho and I've got the Saipan, because it's a premium and I didn't have it. The only one I've actually played is the Saipan, and that was in an operation, and I sucked. I might actually consider playing aircraft carriers, if not full-time, then at least more than never, if this change goes ahead. Well, let me know what you think in the comments, not just for the aircraft carriers, of course, but also for the submarine gameplay footage that you've seen, and will soon be able to try for yourself in the Halloween special event coming up next month. As always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.